What happened in the year 1933? Everything I show you in this video is specific to the year 1933. Before the main feature, I'd like to tell you about some of the comic strips and cartoon characters that debuted this year. Comic strip debuts of 1933. The Adventures of Smilin' Jack, a good time adventure strip with a pilot hero. The Ambassador, a short-lived comic strip by Otto Saglo that was an intentional ripoff of his own popular comic strip, The Little King. This strip was created as a placeholder for King Feature Syndicate while Saglo was still under contractual obligation to The New Yorker, where The Little King was appearing. In 1934, when Saglo could move to King Features, The Ambassador was dropped and The Little King took its place. Brick Bradford. He was a sci-fi hero like Buck Rogers, whose strip started in 1929. The also similar Flash Gordon did not debut until 1934. Captain Easy. This adventure strip was a spin-off of the popular Wash Tubbs comic strip and outlasted it by a shot. It had humor, and his adventures were more down-to-earth than heroes like Buck Rogers or Dick Tracy. Cicero's Cat, a spin-off of the popular Mutt and Jeff comic strip. This was also well-liked, but generally stayed a topper strip for Mutt and Jeff and rarely was given its own spotlight. Mutt's son was named Cicero, and his cat was named Desdemona. She may not be as well known as Crazy Cat, Heathcliff, or Garfield, but for many years Cicero's cat was a very popular comic strip kitty. Dan Dunn. This strip is a shameless ripoff of Dick Tracy, which made its debut in 1931. The artwork mimics Dick Tracy. The hero is also a detective, but, in some kind of attempt to separate him from Dick Tracy, is also a secret agent. I'm surprised there wasn't a lawsuit to shut this strip down. Dan Dunn was actually pretty dull in comparison to Dick Tracy, but had its audience and was around for 10 years. He also appeared in comic books, Big Little Books, and a radio show. When Dan Dunn was done, he was done, and he is little remembered today. Dickie Dare. This was a fun adventure strip that should be more well known than it is. It was the first comic strip created by the legendary Milton Caniff. By the next year, he would create the extremely successful Terry and the Pirates. By the end of 1934, Caniff was done with Dickie Dare, but it was continued by other artists until 1957. It was similar to Terry and the Pirates. Dickie Dare was the boy hero of the strip who shared adventures with the freelance writer Dynamite Dan Flynn. However, this was not the strip's format in 1933. In 1933, and until the spring of 1934, Dickie Dare dreamed himself into adventures with epic characters like Robin Hood, Robinson Crusoe, and King Arthur. Caniff quickly tired of this formula, however, and changed the strip from fantasy to reality. He also added the character of Flynn. It was the right choice. Little Joe. This Western comic strip could be very funny, but also very serious. By the early 1950s, the strip became purely comedy. The strip actually worked better when it was being funny because the characters had such well-defined, quirky personalities. Radio Patrol. This comic strip was created at the Boston Record newspaper to compete with Dick Tracy, but it certainly wasn't a ripoff. It was originally called Pinkerton Jr. and featured a boy named Pinky. In 1934, the strip was picked up by King Features and was rechristened Radio Patrol. It became a hit and was noted for its serious tone. Unlike Dick Tracy, there was no evidence of the fantastic or supernatural, just cop action. They even strived for realism. The main character became Sergeant Pat. It was even given a radio show and a movie serial. Uncle Art's Funland. A.W. Nugent created this puzzles and games feature. He also did a lot of work for comic books. Nugent sometimes, but rarely did just regular funny cartoons. Almost everything he did was a puzzle or some kind of activity. Continued by his son, it ran until 1991. Then, surprise surprise, it was brought back in 2009 and still exists as of 2023. The creator of the feature nowadays goes by N.A. Nugent, which some people believe is a pen name that stands for Not a Nugent. Cartoon debuts of 1933. Disney's Three Little Pigs made their debut this year. The Three Little Pigs cartoon was a smash hit and introduced an extremely popular song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? There would only be 4 more cartoons with the Three Little Pigs through 1941, but the characters have always been popular in comics and other merchandising. Popeye the Sailor made his comic strip debut in 1929, but he did not make his first theatrical cartoon until 1933. He was introduced in a Betty Boop cartoon from Fleischer Studios. Fleischer, and later Famous Studios, continued to feed us a steady diet of 231 Popeye cartoons through 1957. Wow, that's a lot of cartoons. Then, something even more incredible happened. From 1960 to 1962, another 220 Popeye cartoons were made expressly for television by 6 different studios. Since that time, there have been various Popeye cartoon shows and specials. I guess he was a hit. Another popular comic strip character that made his cartoon debut was the Little King. Compared to Popeye, the Little King's filmography is weak. He was given 12 cartoons between 1933 to 34, produced by Van Buren Studios. He had 1 more cartoon in 1936 with Betty Boop, and that was it. Betty couldn't do for Little King what she did for Popeye. Terrytoons did something rather interesting this year. They started a series of cartoons that spoofed the old-time melodramatic plays, as well as the old silent movie serials. The heroine was a sexy blonde named Fanny Zilch. The hero was the studly cowboy Strongheart. The villain was the sinister Oil Can Harry. Almost all the dialogue was done in opera style. Of the 8 cartoons that were made in this series, 5 of them were done in 1933. Despite the short run, the cartoons were hits, especially those made this year. And they were funny. As time went on, it was clear to see that Oil Can Harry was the funniest character. Fanny Zilch was drawn extremely sexy in the early cartoons, but was toned down in later entries. Although these cartoons wrapped it up in 1937, they were brought back in a way via the popular Mighty Mouse cartoons. Mighty Mouse started in 1942, but in 1947, the villain Oil Can Harry was reintroduced as a cat. A mouse version of Fanny Zilch was also introduced, but named Pearl Pureheart. Mighty Mouse himself became a new version of Strongheart. The format became so well known that people think these 3 characters were in every Mighty Mouse cartoon. In reality, this lineup appeared in only 14 out of 81 cartoons. It's memorable pop culture, and it all started with Fanny Zilch. Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons were around in 1933, but their early years were met with limited success. The boy character of Buddy was introduced as a replacement for their first star, Bosco. Buddy didn't do all that well in his 2-year stint, besides the fact that he was aggressively promoted. Super success with Bugs Bunny was a long way off. Meanwhile, at Van Buren Studios, Cubby Bear was introduced. He was simply a ripoff of Mickey Mouse. POPEYE Works had 2 new developments this year. One was the boy character of Willie Whopper, who told fantastic stories. The other was the better-known Comic Color cartoon series. As the name suggests, these cartoons were all in color. They were almost entirely new versions of classic children's stories. These cartoons are still well known thanks to cheap home video releases. Popular tunes of 1933. There were many popular songs this year, but here are some of the most notable. Night and Day was huge. Leo Reisman and his orchestra, with vocals by Fred Astaire, had the greatest hit with it. The Last Roundup was made popular by George Olson and Guy Lombardo, to name a few. Stormy weather was recorded heavily this year by big names like Leo Reisman, Ethel Waters, Guy Lombardo, and Duke Ellington. Ted Lewis and his band did Lazy Bones. Don Bester had a hit with 42nd Street, which was also a popular movie this year. Did you ever see a dream a walking? Is a good tune I always liked. It was introduced in the film Sitting Pretty, also from this year, and has been covered by many, many people well into the rock and roll era. In 1933, popular versions were recorded by Eddie Duchin, Guy Lombardo, Bing Crosby, and Meyer Davis. Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf was an interesting milestone in music history. It was a song made for the Disney cartoon that year, The Three Little Pigs, and became so huge that many, many people felt they had to make records of it. At least 4 people recorded it in 1933, with the biggest version by Don Bester. It's still one of Disney's biggest songs. Guy Lombardo had yet another big hit this year with Annie Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And last but not least, the movies of 1933. One thing I discovered is that there were a lot of movies released in 1933. Too many to mention. I decided to cover the movies that were the most popular or most significant. Some of these movies may not have been big money makers at that time, but since their release have become classics. Just for starters, King Kong. The very first King Kong movie was a monster hit for RKO. So much so that a sequel was released the very same year called Son of Kong. The Invisible Man. Universal's The Invisible Man was so popular that all kinds of sequels and rip-offs have been made over the years. Duck Soup, a very famous Marx Brothers movie. Tugboat Annie. Alice in Wonderland. Long before Disney's animated film, there was this live-action version of the classic story. Don Quixote. There are a number of differences between this movie and the classic book, but who cares? It's fun to see Don Quixote on screen, and the spirit of the movie is the same. King of the Jungle. Buster Crabbe as a jungle man. In and of itself, this movie is not so significant. However, later in the year, it led to his first and only appearance as Tarzan in Tarzan the Fearless. People are often under the impression that he played Tarzan a lot, but he only did it once. A Study in Scarlet. Just one of many Sherlock Holmes movies over the years, but the only one in 1933. Laurel and Hardy. 1933 was a productive year for the comedy duo. Sons of the Desert is one of their very best movies, and that came out very late in the year. Earlier in 1933, they came out with The Devil's Brother, Busybodies, Dirty Work, Me and My Pal, Midnight Patrol, and Twice Two. Our Gang. Later known best to everyone as The Little Rascals, the children's comedy troupe had a number of memorable shorts this year, including Bedtime Worries, Fish Hooky, Forgotten Babies, The Kid from Borneo, Mush and Milk, and Wild Poses. The Three Stooges. The Stooges didn't start making their own comedy shorts until 1934. Before that, they were the underlings to Ted Healy and billed as Ted Healy and his Stooges. They made 5 shorts with Ted Healy at MGM. 4 of them were released in 1933. These were Nursery Rhymes, Hello Pop, Beer and Pretzels, and Plain Nuts. One thing audiences discovered is that they didn't like Ted Healy, but they loved the Stooges. Columbia Pictures hired the Three Stooges, and history was made. Ginger Rogers. Ginger had already been making movies, but it wasn't until 1933 when she made her first picture for RKO called Professional Sweetheart. This one isn't as well remembered today, but just a little later, she made her first appearance with Fred Astaire in Flying Down to Rio. She was also in Gold Diggers of 1933. Adventure movies. Rin Tin Tin Jr. replaced the original Rin Tin Tin, who died the previous year. His first movie was the serial Wolf Dog. Another serial of note is the then modern-day version of The Three Musketeers with John Wayne. This time around, the Musketeers were changed into soldiers of the French Foreign Legion. The Perils of Pauline was a highly anticipated remake of the 1914 serial of the same name. Since then, there have been 2 more remakes of Pauline, but more importantly, a ton of rip-offs and parodies. The whole idea of the woman being the heroic lead of her own movie has its origins with The Perils of Pauline. Airplanes and pilots continued to be big thrill fests for moviegoers. The movie The Eagle and Hawk and the serial Phantom of the Air are just a few worth mentioning. Western movies. Most people like at least one Western movie. 1933 put out a lot of them. It would be unnecessary to list all of them. There were a lot of films and serials, but the stars stood out more than anything. Some of these personalities included Johnny Mac Brown in Fighting with Kit Carson, Buck Jones in Gordon of Ghost City, Bob Steele in The Mystery Squadron, which was a Western pilot hybrid movie, and Tom Tyler in Clancy of the Mounted. This was one of a number of Western movies made about Canadian Mounties. You will sometimes hear people refer to this kind of movie as a Northern, but it functions exactly like a Western. Drama and romance movies. Here we go, the heavy stuff of the year. These are the movies that were trying to be award winners, and some of them were. Dickie Moore was just finishing his stint with the Our Gang Little Rascals comedies when he moved into features, like Oliver Twist. Based on the classic story by Charles Dickens, it was a gritty departure from what Dickie Moore had been doing. People liked it, and he had a good career as a child actor. The Private Life of Henry VIII was the film that made Charles Lauden's career. Everything that people recognize about the image and personality of Henry VIII comes from this popular movie. Paul Robeson was the star of the black-lead film Emperor Jones. This was not a Hollywood movie, as it went outside the studio system and was privately financed. It was a disappointment at the box office, but over the years developed a following. Since this film went into the public domain, it became very easily available, and a lot of people have discovered it. The Power and the Glory, with superstar Spencer Tracy, has been considered as a prototype for the 1941 film Citizen Kane, which became one of the most acclaimed movies of all time. The Power and the Glory, however, was a box office bomb. This just goes to show you that timing is everything. What people aren't ready for today can be a hit tomorrow. Other popular, serious films of the year include Cavalcade, Dinner at 8, Lady for a Day, Little Women, and The Story of Temple Drake. Musicals. When musicals made big bucks. The top musical of 1933, as far as box office returns, is said to be Eddie Cantor's Roman Scandals, which is also supposed to be the #1 movie of the year. What's funny about this is that it's not a movie a lot of people know today as well as King Kong, The Invisible Man, Sons of the Desert, or so many other films from 1933. Another musical that many more people will be familiar with is 42nd Street, which is said to be the 8th highest grossing movie of 1933. The very first version of Victor and Victoria came out in 1933. It was made in Germany and got a lot of international attention. The musical comedy was about a woman pretending to be a female impersonator. It was remade a number of times, but the version most familiar to fans is the 1982 film Victor Victoria with Julie Andrews and James Garner. Horror movies. We've already looked at King Kong and the Invisible Man, but 1933 produced other memorable scary movies. The good thing about horror movies of 1933 is that they were more story-oriented and didn't try to gross you out. The vampire bat is better known to people today than it was at the time, due to the fact that it's in the public domain and very easy and cheap to obtain. It was a B movie, but surprisingly well done. It took decades for audiences to truly appreciate it. The Monkey's Paw is an old story that has been adapted to film many times. It has also been heavily imitated and even spoofed. The Mystery of the Wax Museum is another notable horror movie. Supernatural was a movie ahead of its time. At a seance, a woman is possessed by the spirit of an evil murderess. Her killing instincts were driven by sexual passion. The sexual content is what kept this movie from being shown regularly on television in the decades to come. All of this subject matter was very taboo in 1933. Today, this movie is pretty mild. It wasn't a big hit in theaters, but it's better known today. The star, Carole Lombard, was a comedian by trade and resented this very serious role. Movies by the stars. There were many, many big-name actors and actresses in 1933. You had Clark Gable and Jean Harlow, who packed them in when they were working together or separately. Bette Davis, one of the most famous actresses of all time, had a very busy year and her greatest success was yet to come. Gary Cooper was an established leading man. At this time, Barbara Stanwyck was the queen of the sexy girl actresses. She wasn't goofy or funny like other Hollywood beauties of the time. Barbara was just plain sultry, and she didn't always play the good girl. In 1933, tough guy actor James Cagney would also do the occasional musical or comedy film when he wasn't playing gangsters. A lot of people don't know that Loretta Young had been in show business since she was 2 years old. By the time 1933 rolled around, she was already a screen veteran, and her career was far, far from over. She was a very dependable dramatic actress. George Raft, who was famous for playing gangsters, made 3 films in 1933, and he wasn't a gangster in any of them. As a matter of fact, in Midnight Club, he was an undercover detective after a gang of jewel thieves. No coin-flipping gangster in sight. Myrna Loy was a star in 1933 and had been around for quite a while, but she wouldn't become a superstar until 1934 when she was cast in the first Thin Man movie opposite of William Powell. However, 7 movies in 1933 was not a bad gig. Legendary comedian W.C. Fields also had a good year. He was in 3 feature films, 3 comedy shorts, and did cameos in 2 very short one-reelers. The Fatal Glass of Beer is a comedy short that you hear a lot about. It's in the public domain, so it's been easy to find on home media for years. Besides that, it's just very funny. Being set in a Yukon cabin, the short makes fun of those serious plays that are set in one room. Then there are the movies of song and dance man Jimmy Durante. Wheeler and Woolsey is a comedy duo that has been nearly forgotten by movie buffs today. They were very funny and very big stars in the 1930s. But Woolsey's death in 1938 not only ended the team, but Wheeler's career as well. Wheeler continued to work as much as he could, but never regained the momentum he had with Woolsey. In 1933, they made 2 films and 1 short. Woolsey, who had glasses and a cigar, reminds people today of George Burns. George Burns was around back then, but he didn't wear glasses until decades later. Mae West continued to be big in 1933. Marion Davies, who is better known as a silent film actress, continued to make movies in the sound era. She made 2 in 1933. Transitioning to sound films wasn't easy for Marion. For one thing, she had a persistent stutter that she had to keep under control. Will Rogers, the famous movie cowboy, made 3 movies that year and he didn't play a cowboy in any of them.